postal workers deliver the mail through the coronavirus recession. Yet despite the desperate need for cash, the Washington Post reports that the Trump administration has blocked potential emergency funding, threatening to veto the $2 trillion coronavirus legislation if it contains any money to bail out the postal agency. I'd like to welcome Congressman Gerry Connolly. He represents Virginia's 11th District and is the chairman of the House subcommittee responsible for the Postal Service. Congressman, thank you so much for your time today. First, I'd just like to get your reaction to that story about the White House threatening to veto legislation if it includes funding for the Postal Service.
This is another example of this president and this administration putting ideology or politics for them. Businesses are closed, events have been canceled, we're shut in our houses, we can't go to work, we can't see our relatives or friends, even on a day like today, Easter or Passover. And yet we count on the postal delivery every single day. The Postal Service is an essential service. It brings medicine, drugs, medical equipment, foodstuffs, essential documents to our houses every single day, every house, and every business. And it is unconscionable that the president, looking at that service and understanding that it's insolvent, and rapidly deteriorating because of this pandemic, volume is collapsing. We saw a 30% collapse in volume last week. And by midsummer, we expect to see half the volume we had before the pandemic. And all the revenue associated with that goes out the door. And so we got to keep the Postal Service going. People depend on it, especially in rural America, which, by the way, is the Republican part of America. So for President Trump to decide he's not going to help because he believes they give a special deal to his enemy, Jeff Bezos and Amazon, is, as I said, unconscionable in the midst of this pandemic. We need to infuse capital to the Postal Service like we have other businesses and industries to keep it going, to serve the American people. It's not a bailout. It is a rescue in the midst of this pandemic, which is not of their doing.
What would that rescue look like? How much is actually needed to make sure that the Postal Service is able to stay afloat during this time?
So on a unanimous vote last week, the Postal Board, which has 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, several of which are appointed by Trump himself, unanimously said we need $25 billion cash infusion right now to stay afloat because of COVID-19 related lost revenue. We need $25 billion for infrastructure so we can modernize the Postal Service and make sure it is up and running when we need it. We need debt forgiveness of $14 billion, and we need a line of credit that is unrestricted. Those are the 4 things. They're reasonable. We bailed out the airline industry with more money than that. And the airline industry, of course, had record profits these last 5 years, unlike the Postal Service, and doesn't have a mandate for universal service. It gets to pick what routes it's going to serve. So I think it's a reasonable request. I'm urging my colleagues to include it in the next bill. And I would hope the president, upon reflection, would understand that whatever his beef with a particular company ought not to color the work of the 650,000 postal workers in America who are putting themselves at risk every day. 1,000 of them have contracted COVID-19 or presumed to. 20 have died. And 6,000 are out of work because they're in self-quarantine because of exposure to COVID-19. They're a workforce putting themselves at risk.
It's very clear. Congressman, it's clear where the president and his administration is on this question. My question to you then, especially as you underline the need for this service, especially in rural communities, do you think then that you will be able to get enough Republican support inside the House to push this through, to perhaps persuade the president to take a second look at this?
I believe we can. There are lots of Republicans who have worked with me and my Democratic colleagues who care about this issue on comprehensive postal reform. There are lots of Republicans that have worked to preserve 6-day-a-week delivery. So this hasn't been a partisan issue. The only one who's made it partisan is the president himself. And we need him to back off. We need him to re-examine what's at stake here.
I do want to ask you one more question before I let you go, Congressman.
Sure.
After the president fired 2 inspectors general, you and Representatives Lynch and Maroney introduced legislation that protects the new chair of the Pandemic Response Accountability Commission. What would that look like?
Well, we want to insulate inspectors general from political interference. They're the last line of resort in terms of making sure we have objective, neutral analysis of programs, spending, issues, graft, malfeasance, you name it. They're the ones charged with keeping everything else honest and clean. If you start politicizing that, you're going to the very heart of the integrity of our government and oversight itself. So we want to create 7-year terms, and you can only be removed for cause, significant cause that's documented, and to make sure that those inspectors general are chosen on a nonpartisan, objective basis based on professional credentials, not on political whims or political proclivity.
All right, Congressman Connolly, thank you so much for your time today.
Hey, my pleasure. Stay safe.
You too. President Trump